Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Misinformation, fake news, hate speech, satire, the arts, political protest. These are all examples of what you might call disruptive speech. A free speech absolutist would say that all of these forms of speech should be tolerated, if not welcomed. On the other hand, it does look as though some of them are disruptive in a good way, and others are disruptive in a bad way. But can we tell the good from the bad in a way that isn't just politically partisan? Carl Fox, lecturer in applied ethics at the Idea Centre, thinks we can, and that we should treat different forms of disruptive speech differently. Welcome to the podcast, Carl.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Excellent. We're going to talk about disruptive speech. So it's always worth starting with some definitions, maybe. So could you just tell me, first of all, what do you mean by disruptive speech? What do you have in mind when you use the words disruptive speech?
Sure. So what I have in mind is speech that challenges either directly or indirectly by, say, undermining social norms. So kind of rules for behavior that we've internalized and we kind of enforce on each other through social sanctions. Right. So you can kind of directly challenge that by saying, why on earth are you following this social norm? Right? That looks wrong for these reasons. Or you can do it indirectly, particularly by behaving in a way or kind of saying something that asserts a contrary norm that would contradict it.
Okay.
Because it then unsettles people's connection to or kind of conviction that norm is right. So here's an example, right? Let's start with Trump. If we're going to do examples about speech, we should probably start with Trump. So you may remember in one of the debates against Hillary Clinton, Clinton was having a go at Trump for not paying his taxes. So I think he was refusing to release his tax returns or whatever. She's like, well, why are you not doing that? I know why, because you haven't paid any tax. And this is supposed to be a problem, or it's supposed to be an embarrassment for Trump, because most of us think we should pay our taxes. It's good to pay your taxes. Taxes pay for important things. And Trump's response is, that makes me smart. Now, that's disruptive, right? Because the implication is that you're a sucker for paying your taxes. You shouldn't pay your taxes. And that it's a bad idea that we ought to expect other people to pay their taxes. And it's appropriate, in fact, to think Trump's a really clever, impressive person for not doing this thing that most people thought they were supposed to do. Yeah. So that's disruptive, right? Because it kind of, if Trump is right, or if you kind of agree with what Trump is saying, or even if you kind of are prepared to go with him some way along the road, well, then the social norm that everybody should pay their taxes is kind of a little bit weakened, right? It's kind of, its grip is a little bit less secure than it was. Yeah. So that's what I have in mind, stuff like that. And it can be good as well as bad, okay? Right. So just to give a really vivid contrast, if you got Trump on one end, on the other end, maybe you got someone like Jesus Christ, right? So Jesus comes along and Jesus says, love thy neighbor as yourself. That's disruptive, because that's not what people do, right? People think you should probably, other things be equal and doesn't cost you too much, be nice to your neighbor, be prepared to help them out, but love them as yourself, that's very demanding, right? That's certainly not what most people would expect. So that's disruptive as well, but kind of most people would think that's disruptive in a more benign direction than Trump's example.
Sure. So great. So disruptive speech is speech that kind of undermines or weakens the strength of social norms. And as you say, there can be bad forms of disruptive speech and there can be good forms of disruptive speech. And one of the things that you're trying to do is to work out exactly how we should distinguish between bad forms of disruptive speech and good forms of disruptive speech, right? So in order to kind of work our way into that a little bit, I wondered if you could just give us a few more examples of different forms of, well, let's start with bad disruptive speech. So I think you've got a few examples in the paper that you've written on this. One of them being bold-faced lying, right? So you say bold-faced lying is a bad form of disruptive speech.
Yeah, so I mean, Trump's obviously the and a prime example of this, but even like someone like Boris Johnson, right? Kind of like you might kind of think lots of things that kind of Boris Johnson would say. It's not really clear that he expects anyone to believe him. He's not trying to deceive anyone, but you know, he wants to assert that something is the case in order maybe kind of like to try and make it the case, or in order to try and kind of convince people to come along with them. And kind of not leave them kind of open to certain kinds of attacks. I mean, the example I use in the paper is kind of like Trump's, at some point we'll have to get away from Trump. But his assertion that there was no quid pro quo in this call he had with Zelensky in Ukraine.
Right.
Right. But of course, there was a quid pro quo. Like, we all know that, right? Trump was trying to basically extort blackmail material out of Ukraine in order to damage Joe Biden. But of course, he can't admit that, right? Because if he admits that, then he's in trouble. Then the impeachment proceeding against him gain a whole load of juice. Then there's a round of negative coverage. So even though everybody kind of, who pays any attention, knows what's going on, he can't say it. So he doesn't say it.
Right.
The bold-faced lie serves a purpose, but it's not really intended to deceive. But it's disruptive because we all generally think you should tell the truth, right? That's the way you're supposed to behave in interactions with other people, is that if you're asked a question, you give a straight answer. And of course, if you don't give a straight answer, then, it's now salient to people. It's like, oh yeah, that's a thing I can do too, right? If I don't want to admit something that I find uncomfortable or pass on some information I don't wish to share, maybe I don't have to I thought I had to do it, but maybe I don't.
Yes, yeah. Some of those examples that you've just cited, there's a kind of way in which the people who are doing the bold-faced lying, and just to kind of reiterate, by bold-faced lying, you mean lying where the person who's doing the lying doesn't really expect that their audience is going to believe what they say. So they're kind of, they're saying one thing, which they know isn't true, and they kind of know that their audience know it isn't true as well. So the purpose of them saying it is not to deceive their audience, it's some other purpose. Like with the Trump example, it was to because he can't admit something that's going to make it.
Yeah. Or Boris Johnson, like, we're going to have a world-class test and trace system, or we do have a world-class test and trace system.
Yeah.
So everybody knows, right? It wasn't the world-class test, but it kind of allows him to get through an interview, right?
Yeah.
Like, allows him to get through a kind of like a sticky political moment.
Yeah. And there's ways in which, like, without getting bogged down in kind of specific examples, people who engage in that kind of lying sometimes do so with a kind of smirk on their face.
Yeah.
Right? As if they're kind of, they're signaling that they know that what they're saying isn't true. And they're almost kind of, by doing so, kind of conveying the idea again that people who tell the truth are suckers, right?
Yeah. So the classic example is from a paper by a guy called Don Fallis, and his example is Tony Soprano, right? So Tony Soprano gets wheeled in to the police office to be interrogated about some crime. They can't nail him on it, right? They can't prove it, but they know he did it. He knows he did it. He knows they probably know he did it. So Tony Soprano is smirking away while he's given the kind of expected answers. But of course, the truth is kind of plain for everyone to see.
Yeah.
It's just, he obviously can't admit that then because he doesn't want to go to prison. But there's a disdain for the norm and those kinds of people who are attached to the norm, right? Or kind of think that the norm is something everybody should adhere to.
Yeah.
Kind of like the idea is they're suckers, right? You're a sucker to play this game of truth telling, even when it doesn't suit you.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So that's bold-faced lying. Another example you've got, which is obviously on a lot of people's minds, is fake news. So in what ways is fake news bad disruptive speech?
So fake news, I think, disrupts conventions about kind of what is and isn't news, what is and isn't trustworthy, what is and isn't kind of like good sources of information. But it kind of like intends to smuggle untruths past our epistemic defenses. But what it does is kind of like it purports to be from a certain kind of institution or establishment when it isn't, right? Instead of being from the New York Times, it's a Russian bot factory. And so we have all these norms built up around the institution of journalism that are supposed to kind of make it easier for us to rely on certain kinds of information, and fake news kind of just, gives two fingers to that, right? It's like kind of, we're going to use that against you in order to have you believe what we want you to believe. And so, of course, the moment people start to twig that kind of fake news is a thing, then trust in everything goes down, right? Because now you have to be much more on your guard. Yeah. So kind of the assumption that, well, kind of if somebody was purporting to be a journalist, they probably were, and therefore there was a degree of kind of credence you could give to what they said. Well, that's gone, or at least kind of it would be somewhat more foolish to kind of just believe that in the way that people naively did before this era of fake news. Right.
And one of the things that people often say about fake news is that it kind of undermines the idea that there's an objective truth at all, right? So you end up with kind of different bubbles. I mean, in a previous episode of this podcast with Joe Saunders, we were talking about epistemic bubbles, right? So kind of these, your echo chambers as well, these kind of ecosystems that build up online where a group of people have a particular view of reality, which is somewhat impervious to influences from outside. And the way fake news kind of works in that environment maybe is that it sort of undermines the idea that there is a truth which we should all be aiming at. And actually what we end up is with a set of different truths in these different bubbles. And that's kind of...
So I mean, I think
as well, I suppose.
That seems broadly right to me. There are, I suppose, kind of norms of cooperation that we have, and that these have been kind of challenged in recent times, right? So that we would try to come to agreements, right, or at least try to come to reasonable agreement, or assume that there might be a truth of the matter that if we kind of just keep at it, we can discover, and then once we know what that truth is, we can kind of proceed on that basis. But there seems to be kind of more and more people who, are kind of prepared to just jettison the idea of truth altogether, or kind of truth is kind of something that serves some other end. So kind of like what is true is what's useful to believe in order to pursue a particular political agenda.
Yeah.
And that's different to the way it was, right? That kind of, that lack of consensus, or kind of disinterest in kind of forming or maintaining consensus is different. I mean, it's not to say that kind of it's entirely new, right? Can be been doing something like that forever, but the scale and the kind of the level of acceptance it's found now is kind of different.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then another example of bad disruptive speech that you cite is hate speech. So in what ways is hate speech disruptive in the kind of sense that you've got in mind?
So let's say you put a board outside your pub saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. Okay. I mean, what does that do? That says the kind of the person who owns this establishment and the people inside it don't think that blacks and dogs and Irish people should be treated with anything like the standing and respect that you would normally expect them to be treated with, right? So there's kind of a general belief that kind of people are moral equals. They ought to be treated as such. This is saying, well, we don't have any truck with that, right? Some people are moral equals. These people aren't, right? If they're people at all. So kind of the normal norms of respect and courtesy that you would extend, you don't extend them to these people.
Yes, okay.
I mean, it's worth saying as well, the kind of the contrary. So, I mean, you see these brilliant T-shirts now, kind of more blacks, more dogs, more Irish. That's disruptive speech as well, because obviously, I mean, it's less the case than it was before, but, sadly, still the case that there's kind of plenty of discrimination around, explicit kind of overt discrimination. But those kind of T-shirts are saying for those people who kind of buy norms that are discriminatory, well, you ought not to buy those norms, right? Those norms are wrong.
Right.
So kind of there's loads of scope to be disruptive, and some disruptive speech is brilliant, but some disruptive speech can be really harmful.
Good, right. So I guess what that example shows is that the norms that are being disruptive, they don't have to necessarily be, well, I mean, they could be norms that we think are good norms, and they could be norms that we think are bad norms, but they also, it's not like they have to be kind of universal norms that are being undermined, right? So you could have disruptive speech that undermines a norm that's only held by a minority of people in society, and it would still count as disruptive speech.
That's right. So, I mean, it's got to be some class of a group, right? I mean, like one person can't make their own norms.
Yeah.
I mean, a person can have their own beliefs or their own code, but you need kind of like a group to kind of like enforce it on each other for something, I think, to really count as a norm, right, in the sense I'm thinking of it.
Okay, great. And I suppose the other thing that's worth saying is that, so you've got three different kinds of speech there: bald-faced lying, fake news, and hate speech. And you're saying that one thing that unites those three different forms of speech is that they are disruptive, but you're not saying necessarily that the only reason those things are bad is because of the way they're disruptive, right? So there could be, I mean, hate speech, for example, is bad just because of the way it directly harms the people it's directed at, as well as the fact that it undermines a norm which we think is valuable. But what you're saying is that one of the things that's bad about those different forms of speech is the way in which it disrupts and undermines norms.
Yeah, that's right. So one of my goals in the paper is to try and capture a trend that I think is really bad and I think is real. And I suspect I'm not the only one to have this thought, but that there's a wave of problematic speech that's kind of poisoning or toxifying the public sphere.
Right.
And that this is a unified phenomenon, right? There's something that holds it together as a kind of a clear and distinct threat to the kind of representative democracy we aspire to have, right? And it's not obvious that these things are united in that way because, like you say, they're kind of clearly and obviously wrong for different reasons, right? So, I mean, another example I kind of give in the paper is political hyperbole, right? Which is pretty close to a bald-faced lie, but maybe slightly
Right.
Slightly different. So like when Boris Johnson puts 350 million on the side of the bus, right? It's like, okay, that's bad. But why is it bad? Well, part of the reason why it's bad is because some people probably believed it, even though it was nonsense. And then it kind of cast a consequential or potentially consequential vote on that basis, or at least kind of in voting kind of like helped to bring about a really consequential event. And kind of manipulating people, deceiving them, and kind of leading them to do something that might be against their interest. We generally think that's really bad, okay? But that's different to why we think hate speech is bad, right? Hate speech is bad because it kind of like contravenes and undermines the standing of kind of particular groups, usually vulnerable groups, right? Calls into question this idea that they really do have the standing of moral equals. And so, yeah, you look at these things, you have a sense they seem to be in some way connected, but they look like they're wrong for different reasons. So the kind of normal philosophical response would be, well, actually what we need to do is need to divide these up, right? It'd be a mistake to group them all together. But I think sometimes that impulse is misguided. And the reason why I think it's misguided in this case is because some of the time things that are morally wrong for more than one reason.
Right.
Okay. And when they're wrong for more than one reason, what often happens is that we pick the worst reason, okay, the thing that makes them the most wrong, and focus on that. And that's then the kind of the wrong that we associate with that action. But if something can be wrong for more than one reason, then even though they kind of differ in terms of some of the wrongs, there might be a wrong that they have together that they share, right? There might be one way in which all these kinds of speech are wrong, and they share that. And that, I think, is what makes them what I want to call bad disruptive speech, right? So ultimately, I think the story to be told there is that they threaten the stability of a political community in a particular way. And that also then helps me to do something else I want to do in the paper, which is I want to be able to draw a nice, clear distinction between what I'm calling bad disruptive speech and then what I'm calling good disruptive speech, because there is a tradition in political philosophy all the way back to Mill, which suggests that all disruptive speech must be good.
Right.
Okay. And that we should welcome all, even like the most noxious, hateful versions of it, because at the very least, it helps us to reaffirm our commitment to true principles or good principles. Yeah. And so that's where you get kind of some of the really strong anti-cancel culture. The justification for that kind of position is, well, no, we can't be cutting ourselves off from any disruptive speech because it's all good in some ways. And I think even though there are genuine concerns about how far we might want the state to go in kind of banning or prohibiting speech, I think it's still worth being able to draw a clear distinction between the kinds of disruptive speech that we welcome and would like to promote, and the kinds of disruptive speech that really don't have very much going for them, right?
Good.
Because, Mill, there's a lot to be said for kind of Mill's view, but kind of generally now, I think what most political philosophers think is that Mill's kind of view that we should be really excited to engage with bad disruptive speech of all kinds kind of works in a very specific setting, like a seminar setting.
Right.
We're kind of like everybody's committed to rules of discourse and we have as long as we take to get to the truth.
Yeah.
It's not, but that's just different to kind of, people are kind of scrolling through, their Twitter feeds on their phone or whatever, right? It's just not anything like that setting. So the kinds of goods you might get even from the worst forms of bad disruptive speech, lots of time there's just no realistic chance we're going to get those. And so it's worth being able to say, okay, well, that's bad disruptive speech and we don't like it and it's wrong for this reason. And there may be kind of legitimate ways of discouraging it.
Great. Okay. So we've covered quite a lot of ground there.
Probably too much, right?
Take a few steps back. So, so there's a question about how do we distinguish bad forms of disruptive speech from good forms of disruptive speech? And then there's going to be a further question. Well, in that case, having made that distinction, what do we then do about bad forms of disruptive speech? But maybe before we even get to that point of making that distinction, I wondered if it was worth giving a few examples of good disruptive speech, right? So again, just to reiterate, disruptive speech is speech that undermines norms in the way that you've been describing. And you think that there are some forms of disruptive speech that are good and useful. So let's just take a couple of examples. So the first one was satire. So in what way is satire disruptive speech?
So I think satire, fundamentally at its core, what it does is it attacks authority. So, I mean, it could be the authority of people, but it could be the authority of other things as well, right? So it could be the authority of norms, but it just juxtaposes the kind of power that whatever it is has with the unsuitability it has for that power. And so it kind of makes it seem silly and ridiculous. And that's why it's usually funny. So satire can kind of poke holes in stuff, right? Can kind of say, well, look, hang on a second. If everybody believes this or everybody acts as if this is true, but this is nonsense, right? This is ridiculous. And it helps us to laugh at it. It also helps us to, I think, kind of hold, in particular, political authorities to account in a really interesting way.
Right.
Because there are norms of deference that we have to people who hold office. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, here's an example from the West Wing, right? President Bartlett like comes in, wanders into it. There's a kind of big reception they're having for like American talk radio hosts or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's some kind of like particular horrible lady who's been kind of bashing on about the worst form of kind of fundamentalist Christianity.
Right.
And Bartlett kind of like asks her a string of questions designed to show kind of like how preposterous kind of her version of Christianity is. And then having kind of humiliated this person, you know, it turns out she's still sitting down, even though everybody else stood up because he entered the room. So the kind of capstone to his kind of little diatribe against her is when the president stands, nobody sits.
Yeah.
So she's supposed to stand up. And there are a few lessons to take from that example, but the one lesson I want to take is that, yeah, kind of like if you meet someone big and powerful, you're inclined to stand up when they stand up, or be really nice to them, or not make them uncomfortable, or be really grateful for their intention, rather than what you might have reason to do, particularly, for instance, if you're a journalist, which is tear into them, right? Which is show them very little respect in order to kind of get at. So in order to puncture, and of course it serves political figures, right, to kind of cultivate or kind of work on these norms of deference, because it makes it less likely that they get uncomfortable forms of criticism. But kind of every so often kind of making fun of them, right, kind of like showing them to be, you know, silly, buffoonish, all the rest of it, just kind of brings them back down to earth a little bit and makes it that bit easier for the rest of us to hold them to account and prevent them from getting too big for their boots. So I think satire challenges norms in a range of ways, but that's, I think, a nice example of how it does it.
Yeah, so the one you're kind of focusing on, the kind of norm that you're focusing on there is, I guess, like a norm of authority, right? So the idea is satire serves to show that some kind of purported authority is not actually, you know, all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah.
So I think of like other examples, it's not just political authority, right? So if you think of, for example, the kind of programs that Armando Iannucci and Chris Morris were making in the 90s, like the Day to Day, that's kind of undermining the authority of the media, right?
Yes.
So the idea is the media is an institution that has a certain amount of power, and by kind of subtly undermining it in the way they were doing, they were sort of trying to show that it wasn't kind of warranted.
Because we talked about fake news undermining norms surrounding the media and our kind of consumption of journalistic content. But if you take someone like Jonathan Pye, right, kind of like, because the way it works is he kind of does the normal journalist bit, right? He kind of like, he's giving his report and then he hands back to the studio or whatever.
Yeah.
And then he says what he really thinks.
Yes.
And then when he's done with that, he kind of switches back into journalist mode and says something kind of really trite or overly balanced, or that bears little or no relation to what he's just told you is the unvarnished truth. And I mean, what does that do? Well, that challenges some of the bad norms that have developed around journalism, right? So kind of like some norms are kind of like false equivalence or balance, and some norms of being, I guess, overly careful with the truth, you know, for fear of appearing to be partisan or something like that, right? So yeah, that's another, I think, nice example of kind of where there's a norm, a problematic norm, and satire just kind of exposes how it's not fit for purpose, right? How it's kind of preventing the institution from doing what it ought to be doing.
Great. And thank you for providing a more up-to-date example than I was able to.
No, I mean, it's just for myself, because otherwise if we do Chris Morris examples, that's what the podcast could be for the next 45 minutes.
That's a good point, yeah. Okay, and then the other kind of good disruptive speech that I thought we might focus on is the arts. So you say there's a way in which the arts can be disruptive speech in a positive way. So how does that work?
Yeah, so the paper probably represents me as being far more artistically literate than I really am. But there's an example there from, basically an experience I had. So I went to a conference and it was in Copenhagen. I was kind of wandering along and kind of came across by accident an installation by Ai Weiwei. And it's called Soleil Levant. And what it was loads of life jackets just bursting out of the windows of kind of like a big old, you know, nice brick building. But it's just like crammed in kind of like hundreds, maybe thousands of life jackets all kind of like bursting out of the windows. And it kind of spoke to me, because I think most people would have an experience of being in a life jacket, you know, like you go on a school trip or a summer holiday or what, and you know, like you can kind of feel what it is to have, they're kind of like a bit damp because someone's used them before. They're maybe a little bit smelly. They're like a bit sandy. You don't really super love putting them on, but they enable you to do this kind of fun thing. So you're already kind of halfway there. You kind of like, there's a tactile physical experience that kind of draws you in.
Sensory experience.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the sensory experience, and then you kind of twig what it is that he wants you to think about, which is what it would be like not to be wearing one of these life jackets if you're doing some fun canoeing with your class, but instead that you're kind of like trying to get across a choppy sea in the middle of the night, and it's freezing cold, and you've come from a horrible place, and there's no guarantee that anything's going to be any better on the other side. And I think what that does is it does a few things. It kind of challenges certain norms, kind of particular specific norms around the kind of case. So for instance, we have kind of like norms around who is and isn't deserving of help. So kind of like who counts as a refugee versus an economic migrant. And it's not clear that those kinds of beliefs, which kind of help to justify our kind of refusal of aid to loads of people, are really kind of good norms, are kind of like appropriately grounded in reasons. But also what it does is it just helps us to do a bit of perspective taking, because it's very easy to not really think about these people as people, or as being people kind of like us in kind of relevant respects. But I mean, if that could be you, right, then the converse could be true, right? That person could kind of do all the things that you do in your life. They could be a kind of good citizen in the way that you are. So kind of why wouldn't they be the kind of person you'd want to have in your community, right? Why couldn't they be the kind of person that you could trust to uphold the values of your community? So it just kind of, it just makes that sort of othering a bit more difficult because, and I think a lot of good art does this. It just kind of gets you out of your specific perspective, which is kind of grounded in the all the actual features of your particular life, and then allows you an insight or a glimpse into what a different life might be like. And that just humanizes the people who live those lives and makes it easier for you to identify with them.
Yeah, good. And again, it seems like presumably there's all sorts of things that artwork is doing. Right.
I imagine it far more sophisticated.
Right. Exactly. But perhaps Ai Weiwei intentionally was trying to work on people's empathy in the kind of way that you described, right? You might not have been thinking in terms of subverting or undermining norms, but one of the functions that artwork seems to have is can be thought of in that kind of way, right?
I mean, so like the kind of tried observation is it makes you think, but good art does make you think, right? It makes you think about a particular important thing. And I think that's an example of how I'm not, obviously not all art is good, but it can be good. And when it is good, it can be really powerful.
Good, makes you think and makes you feel as well, I guess. Good, all right. So we've had some examples of bad disruptive speech and we've had some examples of good disruptive speech. The thing that unites all of those kinds of forms of speech is that they undermine norms in the kind of way that you've described. But it'd be good if we could make a clear distinction between the bad forms of disruptive speech and the good forms of disruptive speech. The most obvious thing, I guess, to think is, well, the bad forms of disruptive speech are undermining good norms, and the good forms of disruptive speech are undermining bad norms. But I guess there might be cases in which people can disagree about what are good and bad norms. So, how do we get beyond that? How are we going to make that distinction ultimately between good and bad disruptive speech?
So I go a slightly different way. So one of the things I'm interested in is the stability of political communities. And by that, I mean a political community is stable if a fairly high proportion of the people living in it are kind of reliably disposed to follow a fair set of rules.
Right.
And by reliably disposed, what I mean is not just kind of that they'll pay their taxes so the tax man doesn't come and find them or eventually they get sent to prison, or Trump thinks they're dumb. Like that they're also prepared to pass up opportunities to cheat, right? So anytime there are kind of rules, there will probably be opportunities to break those rules, right? And so I think kind of a community is stable when most of the people in it kind of follow the rules and are kind of, motivated to continue to follow the rules, even if their self-interest, their narrow self-interest, or kind of maybe their group self-interest, their kind of tribe or their kind of political cause or whatever it might be, could gain something by breaking the rules.
Right.
And instead what they do is they kind of refuse that opportunity, right? And stick with the rules because they're fair. Right. And so I think that's good, right? That's a really important resource that communities have. Okay. I mean, here's an example to illustrate how important that resource is, right? So think about something, that kind of is relatively unremarkable and yet is incredibly remarkable, which is the transfer of power between political opponents.
Mm-hmm.
So we're thinking on a grand scale now. But this is where nascent democracies, new democracies often fall down.
Yeah.
Is because, one government, their term is up and they've been voted out, and what they have to do now is kind of give power to their political enemies, right? You have to give over the tools of the state, right? And the tools of the state are enormous, right? They're kind of hugely powerful. So, I mean, these people could come in, they could disenfranchise you and all your friends, right? They could kind of purge you from the voter lists. They could send the police around. They could change the law. So now all of a sudden you're guilty of crime. They could do all sorts of things with the power of the state.
Yeah.
That will make your life absolutely miserable, if not end it outright. So when you're handing over this power, it's a huge risk that you're taking. And that risk doesn't really make sense unless you think those people can be trusted kind of at least broadly, right, to resist the temptation to cheat or kind of change the rules so that they can bend it kind of in their favor.
Yeah.
Right. The rules kind of broad. I mean, obviously they're going to do things you don't like. They'll pursue policies, but the kind of rules of the game ought to stay roughly the same so that kind of everybody has a fair shout. And this disposition, right, this kind of your willingness to abide by these rules in this way and pass up these opportunities to kind of exploit kind of advantages you might have. That's kind of a difficult disposition to maintain, right? Not just because you're tempted, right? So when these opportunities arise, right, they're obviously tempting, right? It'd be nice if you kind of your party never lost power, right? And it was only ever your policies. That would be great, right? That would really suit you.
And you might think it would be better for everybody.
And you might think,
you think your party's policies are the best policies.
It would improve the whole country, right? It would just be really good.
Yeah.
So you're tempted in this way, but there's another problem, which I think is even more insidious. And so I'm taking this from John Rawls's moral psychology. He says, once you know that you have this temptation, well, you know that everyone else has the temptation as well.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe you can be, pretty assured that you're not going to break those rules. But how do you know about the other people? And like, these are people who are just, from your perspective, wrong about loads of important stuff. Right. And that you have loads of really serious disagreements with. So it might be really hard for you to maintain the belief that they can be trusted in this way, right? That they have an appropriate commitment to this shared set of rules. And once you start to doubt that, then you're kind of on there's a relentless sort of Hobbesian logic that kicks in. And the way my dad always described when we were playing competitive sports was get your retaliation in first, right? Don't wait around for someone to do something to you. If you have good reason to think they're going to do it to you, well, yeah, you'd be a sucker to like wait for that. And then, nobody's like, why would you kind of like do Marquis of Kingsbury rules, right? You get in first and get in hard and make sure you win. So it kind of, when you start to have that worry that the other side or the other community, or whatever it might be, can't be trusted, then you'd be a sucker to play by these rules, to shackle yourself to these rules. Right. And human beings, I mean, it seems to me that this idea of kind of being taken advantage of or made a sucker of is something that just really bugs people. And I've given you the kind of like the grand, like large scale example in terms of transfer power between political opponents. But like, here's a small scale example. So I'm now kind of doing like the run with the kids to crash in the morning.
Yeah.
And just like rush hour traffic, seeing people in rush hour traffic is interesting. It's instructive, but people lose their minds over what would appear to be relatively minor things. Right. So I'm thinking kind of like somebody's kind of pulling up to a junction. They kind of do the right thing. They don't go into the middle of the junction and wait because you're not supposed to block the junction. So they wait. But then the next thing is 4 or 5 cars sneak out, light changes, they miss the light. And then you can see them. They're stewing. They're like, this is not fair. I did the right thing and I've missed out.
Yeah.
And it's only 2 or 3 minutes, but like you can see them from behind them in the queue. Like for now until whenever they get to their destination, they're like, this will not happen again. So they park themselves in the middle of every junction until they get to the school. And if they have to, they will cut. So they've got like 3 kids in the back. There's another like SUV with 4, and they'll nearly hit them just to make the point that like, I will not be taken advantage of. Yeah. People hate this, right? Really, really bugs them. And so kind of like once you start to think that that's what's going on, right? The kind of your adherence to the rules marks you out as someone to be taken advantage of. Well, then you're not going to stick to the rules, right? Or you're going to find it much more difficult to stick to the rules.
Yeah.
And I think what bad disruptive speech all does, or all forms of bad disruptive speech do, is they exacerbate that worry, right? They play on that worry. So they kind of show people, right? So kind of like, there's Trump, right? Breaking the rules.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, well, Trump's breaking the rules. Everyone can break I can break the rules, right? Rule breaking becomes normalized.
Yeah.
And once it becomes normalized, it's kind of much harder now to kind of like enforce those social norms again. They've just lost loads of their bite.
Yeah.
They've kind of brazened it out. So it kind of does that. But it just also kind of embeds in people this thought or and like, so things like kind of fake news and kind of like manipulative Russian bots and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's making people think, oh yeah, everybody's out to take advantage of me, or loads of people are out to take advantage of me, or my political enemies are out to take advantage of me, or my political enemies are out to kind of, I don't know, the impose their PC code, whatever it might be. But I think these forms of bad disruptive speech just make it harder, right, to have the belief that other people can by and large be trusted to stick to a shared set of rules.
Good. Yeah. So the thought is, correct me if I've got this wrong, but the thought is something like the norms that are disrupted by bad disruptive speech is not just that they're good norms, but they're kind of the norms that constitute the rules of the game, right? They're the kind of norms that everybody ought to be able to sign up to, even if they have like radically different views of what the good is or something like that. They ought to be able to sign up to these norms just as a kind of higher set of standards that allow us to kind of play out our disagreements in liberal societies, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely part of it. So there are a lot of specific norms that we're going to want to keep, but I think even more generally, there's this weakening or undermining of the disposition, right, which kind of is kind of above and beyond the weakening or undermining of specific norms. It's kind of just they chip away at, and this is kind of again part of this thought that there's kind of something unified, right, that kind of like holds these things together. That they all feel like they're one wave of, you know, toxifying speech that's kind of unfurling in the public sphere. And I think it's kind of, if they're the kind of thing that kind of does this, that kind of exacerbates the concern.
Yeah.
That, so I mean, let's say the kind of, I mean, I think it's kind of like disruptive speech. If somebody comes like, if I don't know, government minister comes out and it's like, oh, like these political opponents, this woke Twitterati elite, whatever they are, they're kind of like, they're trying to rig the rules of the game against you, right? That's, you know, that's disrupting in that way. It's undermining the sense that you would be justified, that you have a warranted belief that other people by and large can be trusted to stick to the rules of the game.
Right.
And once that belief starts to go, right, like I say, you start thinking, well, I'm going to get my retaliation in first.
Yeah.
And if everybody, or at least a high proportion of people are thinking, I'm going to get my retaliation in first, then it becomes really, really hard to have the kind of political community we want to have.
Great.
Because it kind of depends on there being at least a minimal level of trust.
Okay. Yeah. Got it. So that's how you're making the distinction between good and bad forms of disruptive speech. So in that case, what do you think we should do about bad disruptive speech? So you kind of, in your answer to a previous question, sort of pointed towards John Stuart Mill and ideas around free speech. And it seemed to be kind of hinting that there might be some justification for maybe curtailing some forms of speech if they're disruptive in a bad way. But could you just say a bit more about how you think we should respond to those forms of speech?
Yeah, sure. So let's do it the other way, the less controversial way. We'll go from the easy ones first and then get to the harder question. So, I mean, I think that the easier thing we can do is we can promote good disruptive speech. Okay. So speech that kind of challenges bad norms, speech that kind of helps to inculcate in us a sense that other people kind of, you know, could be trusted, right? So we talked about satire, we talked about the arts, you know, speech that kind of like humanizes other people, that helps us to kind of think of them as the kind of people who could be good citizens, right? With satire, it's, you know, the way in which it kind of holds people to account, well, provides a cost for rule breaking, right? And that means kind of, well, okay, the rule breaking is now more difficult for people to get away with because they'll be humiliated if they do it. Yeah. Or it might do something else as well, that it helps to kind of, by laughing along with it, we kind of reaffirm our commitments to whatever the norm is that's just been shattered, right? So it kind of helps to kind of buttress and build up our commitment to those norms and our general sense, right, that kind of we live in a community where by and large, people, even if they disagree with us about important stuff, can be trusted to adhere to the shared set of rules. So I think kind of like, let's do that, right? So kind of let's, you know, kind of make sure that the public broadcaster is funded, right? So it can kind of incubate forms of satire, right? Make sure there's kind of like healthy arts programs, right? There's funding available for these things. It might be that you kind of try and promote them in other ways, right? So maybe they go on school curricula or whatever it might be. right? But the kind of you make sure this kind of thing is happening, and this kind of thing is happening in a place where people have access to it, right? You don't have to ram it down anyone's throat, but you support it. And even kind of by investing money in it, there's a signal being sent, right? That this is good, right? This is the kind of speech that we want to see, and we would like to have more of it. So I think it would be worth doing that, right? Once we identify good disruptive speech, let's support it and promote it in appropriate ways. Then when it comes to the bad disruptive speech, there are a few things to say. So, I mean, one thing to say is that almost nobody thinks it's impermissible to constrain all forms of speech. Like almost everybody is in agreement that you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater, right? That ought to be illegal, right? That ought to be a crime. You're not allowed to stand outside somebody's house and say, right, you mob over there, come in and like hurt that person. You're not allowed to do those things. You're not allowed to defame people, right? So there's no kind of Rubicon here, right? That we have to be so worried about being crossed, right? We're already in the game of regulating certain kinds of speech. But that said, we do want to be careful, particularly if we have the thought that free speech is at least kind of partially important because it's a civil right that people have against the state, which they can use if the state kind of gets too big for its boots and starts to deploy the coercive power of the state kind of like against the people in an illegitimate fashion. So you want that right to free speech to be pretty robust, even though we're all in agreement that at least some things can't be said. So what can you do? Well, I mean, here's one idea without getting kind of like into specifics. It seems to me that now we're starting to think about the ways in which different speech practices are different and kind of achieve different things and pursue different goals. Well, maybe it's kind of worth focusing on that and trying to make use of it, right? So maybe kind of like instead of thinking about whether or not it's permissible to ban certain kinds of speech, like for instance, hate speech, maybe what we can do is we can discourage them in particular arenas, right? So if we decided that for whatever reason, it's too far for the state to go to say that you can't kind of engage in some particular form of hateful speech. But I mean, we could say we can't do it in, a public square, or you can't do it on the 9 o'clock news, or you can't do it in the carriage of a train, all right? But you can't do it on this corner of the internet if you like, right? Or you can do it on alternate Sundays in kind of this particular park that we've reserved for really noxious protests.
Yeah.
So we can discourage it without necessarily banning it or prohibiting it.
Yes.
And I think that might be the way to go, right? Is to engage in certain kinds of discouragement without necessarily kind of saying to people, you will be put in prison and the state will come down on you like a ton of bricks for articulating this thought that you have. But this thought is really bad, right? Or this thought is really unhelpful. And for that reason, it needs to be constrained in these ways.
Yeah.
I think that might be a partial solution. It's not going to make it impossible to engage in bad disruptive speech. And I think, there are reasons why we wouldn't want to make it impossible for people to engage in bad disruptive speech. But given that if you buy the idea I'm selling, which is that it poses a real danger to the cohesion of a political community, then we ought to be able to discourage it, I think, in some ways.
Okay, great. Maybe just got time for one more question. So one of the things I was thinking when I was reading the paper was, well, what if somebody, so it seems like the kind of definition that you're working with here between good and bad forms of disruptive speech seems to sort of rest on democratic norms to some extent, right? So the idea is like stability in democratic societies is what we ought to be aiming for, and bad disruptive speech is that form, those kinds of forms of speech which is going to undermine stability in that sense. But I wondered, like, what about if somebody was anti-democratic, like that, just kind of sincerely thought that democracy wasn't the best form of government that we could have, and we ought to be, I don't know, aiming for a sort of dictatorship of the proletariat or something like that, right? Instead of democracy. Would that come out as bad disruptive speech on your account?
So I think it's going to depend on the details. So if part of the kind of the explanation or justification for this kind of alternative political system is precisely because people can't be trusted, then I think it's going to be bad disruptive speech, because it's going to exacerbate that concern that we all have, right? Which is that other people are likely to take advantage of us.
Right.
If, however, I don't know, kind of someone comes along and they're like, look, what we really need is an AI overlord, okay?
Right.
And the AI overlord will make sure that, as a matter of fact, everybody is treated more equally than they are now, right? Right. We won't be subject to racist biases or anything like that, right?
Right.
So the AI overlord will be wiser, smarter, will better facilitate us in kind of living a life of leisure and ease, and we'll be able to come up with really clever ways to undo the kind of systematic discrimination that our current political system is burdened with.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that might be wrong, right? There are reasons to disagree with it, but it doesn't strike me as obviously going to exacerbate this worry I have about our moral psychology.
Right.
So I think kind of it's not necessarily going to, certainly not in the short term anyway, it's not going to kind of tear the community apart or make it harder for that community to kind of come together to do normal political things and to kind of be able to resist the kinds of political shocks that just make having a political community more difficult. You know, so kind of if a recession comes along or a pandemic comes along or there are kind of waves of immigration, it gets kind of a bit harder, right? Because everybody's under more pressure. And so kind of like it gets that bit more difficult for you to kind of resist the temptations to break the rules for the sake of you and yours. And also kind of you're more jealous of what you have. So it's easier to be suspicious of other people.
Yeah.
So kind of what we need is kind of like something that kind of help us get through those rocky patches. And I think kind of like if someone's out in the steps saying, well, we need a fascist dictatorship that, you know, I don't know, make sure that Ireland is for the Irish or something. Yeah, that's bad, right? Because anyone who kind of doesn't count within that kind of narrow definition of Irish, well, yeah, kind of like they're immediately now suspect, right? They can't be trusted. They ought not to be citizens. But like, I think it's conceivable that you could have something that is kind of anti-democratic in nature, but kind of doesn't push those buttons in the sort of way I'm worried about.
Right.
I'd still be inclined to disagree with it, but that's another story.
Great. Okay, that's really interesting. Plenty more we could say, but that's all we got time for. So, Carl Fox, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jim.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.